Greetings once again, my friends, and welcome back to Drak Reviews, where we take on a game that, to me, had a lot of promise and unfortunately kind of petered out in the end as we discuss Snake Pass. Now, Snake Pass has since released a multi-console release. It's on PlayStation 4, it's on PC, it's on Xbox. I am actually playing it on Nintendo Switch, and therefore giving you my thoughts on the Switch version. Starting with the story. So, I wish I could say there was a whole lot to this, but basically something is wrong in the world of Snake Pass, and it's up to you as the snake named Noodle to go and fix things. Your little bird friend kind of warns you of the disturbance, and therefore it's up to you to go and fix all of the problems. And you go through levels to be able to collect the various stones you need to move on into the next one, as well as collect various pirate doubloons and water bubbles as you go along. Not really too complex a story, and in fact, I don't have a whole lot of problem with it aside. It's not the most complex thing in the world, and I didn't see it really getting any more complex as far as I got into it, but it is a collectathon. So it's a collectathon game, and therefore a lot of the depth of that kind of a game is not necessarily in the story. It can be in cases like Conker's Bad Fur Day and Banjo-Kazooie, and I would actually say Conker is probably a worst example of a collectathon, but Banjo-Kazooie is definitely one where it's got an amazing story. You can have it, but you don't necessarily need to have it. The gameplay is really where a collectathon thrives. Moving on into the visuals, this game does look really good. I don't necessarily have too much of a problem with how it looks. I even think the expressions on Noodle are amazing. Like that feels to me like Disney Ka from Jungle Book, or basically any kind of cartoon snake you can imagine that came out in like the 80s or 90s. I think he's got a really good reaction to him. I do like the little bird, and I do like a lot of the visuals that you're walking through in the levels. From what I could tell, there wasn't too much diversity in the levels I actually was able to get. Although I will admit one quick thing. You guys are not seeing too much diversity in my footage, and that's simply because for some reason, some footage got bugged out and lost, and so I don't necessarily have a whole lot of the levels that I covered. But visually, I don't really have too many complaints about this game. Gameplay, however, is where I have plenty of complaints. Now, people might remember when I did my Drak tries of Snake Pass, and I was really into the gameplay that they were doing. Specifically, if you haven't played it, it basically works like you're a snake. The gameplay is based around the fact that you're a snake and you're slithering on the ground. It's not like you have a snake with legs, and so you can do a ton of platforming. It's that you slither on the ground and you use your snake body to kind of wrap around bamboo poles and be able to traverse the terrain that way. And even in later levels, you get other features like being able to swim underwater. But unfortunately, while this is an awesome concept on paper and somewhat in practice, its execution kind of fails in the fact that it eventually gets very cumbersome and very frustrating, especially to someone who is not into collectathons. I am very much not into collectathons as a gamer, and therefore it took a lot of patience and a lot of frustration for me to get a lot of puzzles done, and I wasn't necessarily on board with that. It got so frustrating to a point where I almost threw the controller a couple of times trying to get up where I needed to go. And that's definitely not a type of game that I want to be able to play. So I will say that I did take some points off for the gameplay. It's simply because I feel like you could have done something a little bit more to streamline and maybe even make Noodle not as floaty in some cases when he's wrapping around objects. That's where I began to see a lot of the problems. But if you're a collectathon player with a lot of patience, you might be able to get past that hurdle. I don't necessarily like the type of game that it is, and the gameplay is very reminiscent of post-traumatic stress with motion controls. But moving on into the audio, there really isn't too much to judge here. There really isn't a voice cast per se. They kind of went the Banjo-Kazooie route, and they do have like little squawks for the bird, and occasionally Noodle will go, ah, and that's cool. But there isn't too much as far as voice performance outside of that. Audio-wise, though, the music is pretty. I will at least acknowledge that. I didn't have a track that came across as just out of place or anything like that, but that being said, the music is not necessarily more, I remember more than the visuals. after a while, the music can get pretty bland. So again, at that point, it's great when you listen to it the first few times, but after that, you're really begging to hear something a little bit more standout. And moving on into replay value and presentation. Does this game have replay value? I think for a collectathon player with, again, a ton of patience, yes, there is. For anybody else, not really. I think they'll play the first few levels and then they'll get to a difficult one and drop it like a bad habit. Which is really sad because I do know that Sumo Digital worked pretty dang hard on this game and wanted it to be able to be successful. So it's really sad for me to admit that, but also in that regard, according to How Long to Beat, it doesn't really take too long to beat this game. For crying out loud, we had other collectathon games clock in at about 20 or so hours this year, and this one clocks in at, if you're just completing the main story, 6 hours, and I think it was 9 hours for completionist. So that's not a whole lot of time. This is a pretty short game for a collectathon player. As to the presentation, does it come together? Yeah, again, I don't have a problem saying that it's fun for the first few hours, but after that, once you start getting into the difficult levels, it starts to lose that charm. It starts to lose a lot of that original flavor that it had. And that's why I have no problem, unfortunately, giving this a 6 out of 10. It's a solid D effort. I think Sumo Digital did a great job with what they had, and a lot of the stuff probably worked better on paper than it did in actual execution. But for collectathon gamers with a ton of patience, you're going to be able to get some kind of value out of this game. Probably a lot more than even I could get out of it. And I don't necessarily think a D is a bad thing here. I think it was a good first attempt. And maybe if they want to do a Snake Pass 2 or something similar to it, they just need to learn from the mistakes they had in the original Snake Pass. As to the actual value of it, currently you can get it on all the markets that I checked for $19.99. That is kind of an appropriate price, although if you can get it for about $5 to $10 cheaper, I would say wait on it. Like an after holiday sale for $10, I think it would be a little bit more worth it, especially for a collectathon gamer who doesn't necessarily know if this is going to be a lasting thing for them. But $19.99 isn't necessarily a bad price for it. And that's going to go ahead and do it for this review. Thank you guys so much for watching, and of course, I will see you guys next time for the next review.